Welcome to another COAP TV pilot episode. So this one is all about air travel. Like, we are desperate, all of us are desperate to get out there and start taking photographs of aeroplanes all over the world like we always do, right? So COAP last year was something like 32 weeks away out of the country on aviation photography adventures. This year, like one in January, one in February. We're all desperate to get back to it. I know you are as well. So the government is releasing drips and drabs of information here and there, and it changes all the time, so it's really hard to keep up with it. Fortunately, we've got travel counsellors on board. We work with a guy called Alec Walker. He's a professional travel counsellor, and I'm going to hook up with him now to talk about the exact details of what the government have been saying, where we can and can't travel. And I'll tell you what, it's not as easy as it seems. You might think like everything's open now, we can start travelling, but unfortunately it's not. There's a lot of nuances, a lot of gotchas, and an awful lot to think about still. So let's go over now to the Zoom call and see what he's got to say. So Alec, thanks for joining us from Travel Counsellors today. We're all very much looking forward to hearing what you've got to say about the government's guidelines that were released this week. So tell us from the top, what does it all mean for us?
Well, Rich, thanks for having me on. It's a great opportunity to explain to yourself and the COAP customers just exactly what's been happening in the recent world of travel. Obviously, we all understand the bigger picture, and we all know that things have been quite unusual for the past few months, and we're starting to see some changes to that now. So obviously, from the UK government's perspective, where they've announced these series of travel corridors, this means that we're actually starting to see a return of the ability to travel. These announcements are the first step for people to start planning potential travel when the whole restrictions are lifted. So it is a first step scenario, and it does mean that there are other things to take into account. It's not as simple as the government's allowing us to go to Spain, so we can all jet off to Spain.
Let's go. Yeah, no. And I think that's one of the things I wanted to get across is like, you know, these announcements have happened, but, you know, there's so many different bits of detail and nuances with it all. So I'm very much looking forward to hearing your expertise on exactly what it all means for us. So what's the current FCO, the official advice as to where we can travel and what we can do? What have they said?
Sure. So the overarching FCO advice actually is that all but essential travel is still advised against.
So it's is that still the case? Even though they've opened these countries up, it's still only essential travel?
So the overarching advice remains as such, that it is all against all but essential travel. However, the countries that are listed on the travel corridor documentation, they're not all European countries. There are some within the Caribbean. There are some within Asia that are currently permitted to travel as part of the travel corridor, and indeed Antarctica if you fancy a hilly trip away. So they are exempted from that travel advice. Now, the way that the FCO are dealing with this is to leave the overarching advice, because it's easier for them to remove a country from the exempt list than it is to suddenly start applying these restrictions again. Now, the performance of the travel corridor program is likely going to influence the FCO's advice in the future, be that the near future or the medium-term future, in the same way that the performance of countries and their response to the coronavirus pandemic will also continue to affect it. So we may see that a country is exempted from the FCO essential travel advice at this moment in time. However, if they do have another outbreak or something occurs within that country, they may well be removed from that list.
I see. So yeah, it's a good structure, isn't it? So it allows, as you say, that overarching essential travel only, but these countries come on and off that list. So what was it? It was about 70 countries in the end that made it on the good list.
This moment in time, I believe the list is around the sort of 70, 75 mark.
Yeah.
That is on there. Like I say, there's a huge variety, a big number of European countries, a lot of the Caribbean islands, for example. So, if you ever want to get that holiday out to the Bahamas that you've been thinking about, now's a good time. You can.
On the Zoom.
Yeah, well, yes, this is it. That's why we've come up with this.
But so, as tempting as it all is, there's obviously so many other bits to it all, isn't there? So it's really complicated. So one of the main ones was obviously the UK's 14-day quarantine rule. So where does the latest announcements leave all of that?
So the latest announcement, obviously, with these travel corridor program is that if you are returning from a country listed on that travel corridor list, you are actually exempt from that 14-day quarantine upon return. So essentially what's happened is the Foreign and Commonwealth Office and the UK government have assessed that those countries are at a lower risk for transmitting coronavirus by people coming in. So at this stage, that 14-day quarantine for those countries is lifted.
Okay, and then conversely, there's some other issues the other end, though, isn't there? Because not all of those countries are letting Brits in, right?
This is very true. I mean, as the advice stands at the moment, we take staying closer to home. We take Greece as an example. Whilst the UK government has said that we can travel to Greece, the Greeks actually are not currently allowing Brits in. So you would be turned away at the Greek border. Now, at the moment, there is a date of, I believe, the 15th of July, where Greece are going to start allowing that. Okay. But this is one of the difficulties that we're seeing. The government has published this list, which says that they have assessed these countries as being a low risk, but the countries on the list may not assess the UK as low risk and therefore continue to close their borders to us.
So where can people stay up to date with all of that?
So the best advice at this moment in time, obviously speak to your travel agent. They are keeping well and truly on top of everything. And it's constantly changing all the time. If you want to keep an eye on it yourself, the Gov website, the Foreign and Commonwealth Office section of that lists not only the countries and territories that are currently exempt, but also lists essential travel advice for the specific countries.
Cool. And so let's take a big one. Let's take America. I mean, that's still shut pretty much to everyone, right? Is that where's that at?
Absolutely, yeah, absolutely. So the US at this moment, as we're all aware in the media, what's happening in the US with a variety of subjects at the moment, but particularly with coronavirus. The US is definitely facing challenges in dealing with the virus, and the borders do remain very firmly closed to anybody who's not a US or Canadian national at this moment in time.
I see. And how often do you see these things as being reviewed?
So the FCO, under normal circumstances, when they publish advice, it tends to be valid for 30 days.
Oh, right. Quite a long time. Okay.
Now, obviously,
it's a long time nowadays.
It does seem a long time. And whilst there has been no official announcement, obviously with the daily briefings that were occurring with the government, and the fact that our knowledge about coronavirus globally is scientifically and politically evolving all the time, it really wouldn't surprise me if that advice is being reviewed on a more frequent basis.
It makes sense, wouldn't it? Yeah.
Absolutely.
All right, so what about travelling further afield? Let's take Asia, for example. I mean, we all love Japan, right? So where's Japan at the moment?
So Japan comes back to one of those countries that we talk about. As far as the UK government are concerned, it's fine. We're happy to travel there. There aren't any issues. However, unfortunately, Japan is, whilst it's assessed as okay for travel from the UK's perspective, the assessment that the Japanese government have carried out does not allow people who've been in the UK and other countries, certain other countries, to actually enter Japan. So as I was saying previously, each country's government is setting a threshold for what they're going to allow into their country in terms of where people have been, residents of the country. And yeah, unfortunately, the UK doesn't meet that threshold at this time.
So we've seen lots of airlines pumping out adverts and emails coming through of hotels that are opening, etc., etc. But the reality is very different to that in terms of practicality. So talk us through a little bit of that.
Absolutely. I mean, certainly from an airline perspective, all sectors of, as with all sectors of this industry, the airlines are significantly struggling.
Yeah, of course.
I'm sure some of your customers have seen, being the aviation enthusiasts. We're seeing aircraft retirements being brought forward. Yeah. We're seeing staff layoffs, cancellations of training for people. And also, what's making life difficult for the airlines is obviously passengers are trying to claw back money through refunds, and that's actually creating a significant financial shortfall for these airlines. As you state, the difficulty is that the realities of operating a passenger aircraft moving forward, particularly internationally, is going to be very complex.
Yes.
One of the issues, you've got two national authorities involved at either end, the UK and Japan, for an example. A company that needs to protect its staff and its assets. And then you also have the International Civil Aviation Authority and the International Air Transport Association, who are both trying to find solutions that are going to work for everybody, be it the airlines, the passengers. What this means is, in reality, is that every airline's approach is likely to be slightly different.
Okay.
And for example, in the same way that you've always had to check, what's my hand luggage allowance and is my bag too big, you would probably, from an airline perspective, you're going to have to start looking at the health restrictions on board. Obviously, the airlines and the hotels are trying to promote themselves because they're trying to remind people that they are still there. And again, it may be that where you receive an email from Hilton or another hotel chain, you may not be able to go to the Hilton in Tokyo, but actually you might want to break in the UK. So whilst they're advertising themselves as a group, they are, asking you to look at where they exist as well to try and help build that brand back up.
Yeah. No, that's sensible. So obviously at this time, travel insurance is more important than ever. So what have you seen happening on that front?
Well, yeah, obviously travel insurance is absolutely imperative at the best of times, even more so now. The travel insurance industry has taken a massive hit with this, and it's going to be a very interesting time coming out of the other side. We actually saw a huge stop sale on travel insurance at the start of the crisis. A lot of companies instantly pulled new policies. They stopped selling because at the end of the day, as we all know, insurance companies will, try and do anything they can to not actually pay. It's kind of the model as to how it works. And it was way too much of a risk for a lot of them, and it was a way for them to, to mitigate any potential losses.
Yeah, they didn't know what they were up against anyway. We all didn't, right?
So nobody did. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, nobody really knew, and I think that's where the travel insurance industry was definitely at an advantage, because they had the ability to just stop selling things. They had people's money anyway, and it's then just a case of, right, how do we fight, claims and things like that. Most of the companies that stop sale are now back on sale.
Okay, cool.
And actually the products that are available can sort of broadly be split into two categories. There are those that will not cover anything to do with coronavirus.
Okay.
And then there are those products that will cover emergency medical expenses and repatriation if you catch coronavirus while you're overseas, but they won't cover any coronavirus-related cancellation or disruption. So in all reality, even though there may not be a quarantine in place either here in the UK or at a destination that you're wishing to travel to, if you did want to travel somewhere but don't want to run the risk of either being turned away or getting sick before you travel, and therefore potentially losing out on all that money and what could be a fantastic trip, it might be pertinent for people to self-isolate prior to their trip.
Right. Yeah, no, that sounds really sensible, because it mitigates the risk, doesn't it? As it minimises everything.
Absolutely. And if you take those isolation procedures for 2 weeks, for example, then you are minimising the opportunity for you to catch it. Equally, you're able then to, if you need a test, if you need a negative test, you're able to go out and get that test within however many days of your departure, and you know pretty much with 100% certainty that that will be a negative test.
So one of the concerns is obviously if you're in an airliner full of 300 other people, they may not have done that, right? So there is obviously then the risk that you catch it whilst you're on your way to the destination. So, we're certainly not out of the woods yet, are we?
No, definitely not. And this is one of the things that the industry as a whole is trying to sort of figure out and how to mitigate. And this is where, different airlines potentially are going to have different measures because of the different national authorities. And as I mentioned previously, ICAO and IATA are trying to come up with things. Obviously, modern aircraft these days are fitted with the HEPA filters, which are, very, very high-grade filters on the air conditioning systems. If you're wearing a mask, the whole point of the mask is not to protect you from coronavirus, it's to protect other people from you coughing it out, essentially. And, if people want to travel, they'll, take the steps that they need to mitigate that risk.
So what have you seen at airports, for example?
So as with the border restrictions, obviously every country's individual authorities and indeed individual airports, because at the end of the day, they're all owned by different companies. You might have 3 or 4 airports owned by a group, but they're all individual. But they are led by a national authority, and they're all tackling the matter in their own way. So this leads to variations in how an airport is handling it and how they're complying with those national regulations.
Yeah.
I would expect that temperature testing is likely to become the norm at an airport, be it via a handheld device or full-size machines like you see with the full-body X-ray scanners. Or
so it'd just be a procedure you go through.
Yeah, just a walk. It may be walk up to somebody at a just before the immigration line, and they point the temperature tester at your forehead, and if you're okay, then you go into the immigration line. If not, you go somewhere else. Or it might just be a walk through booth before immigration. I say before immigration. That's again. That would be where I would expect it to be, because it's a little bit late once you've passed the immigration process to start.
True.
I'd be expecting to see social distancing enforced in queues. We've all come back to Heathrow in the middle of the rush, and you've got thousands of people that are squashed into a very small area. So while that may make the appearance of the queues being longer, obviously it's actually not the case. It's just that social distancing being enforced. I would expect the use of masks to potentially be mandated in most areas.
I can see that, absolutely.
And I would also potentially expect to see a lot more hand sanitizer stations located around. You're going to probably see not as many shops open, or limits on the number of people going through. So for those of you that are avid duty freeers, you may have to wait a little bit longer for that bottle of something special upon your return. Additional checks that we're likely to see, and we are seeing some airports and countries developing these, and that's documentation requirements.
Okay.
So they may require you to provide a negative COVID test upon arrival. And again, different countries are seeing different requirements. Now, that could be something that you'll actually see checked at your departure airport. So where you would normally have your passport.
Isn't it?
Absolutely. So where having your passport and your visa checked, certain countries now require specific inoculations. So we may start to see that being developed into the departure process, but then also that being checked again upon arrival at an airport.
So another one I'd heard about was when on arrival at certain countries, you have to actually have a sum of money in the thousands, perhaps, that is going to cover you for 2 weeks worth of medical care in that nation. Have you seen anything like that?
It is something that has been reported in the news. I think, if my memory serves me correctly, that was an African country who, shall we say, their economy is not known to be one of the best in the world. And obviously, taking care of somebody with a serious case of coronavirus and potentially those underlying conditions will take, an awful lot of time, money, and resources. So that country, for example, may not be able to provide that upfront and then, wait 6 months for your travel insurance to pay out. So
understandable.
Whilst I don't think it's going to be a widespread scenario, it is something that, we are expecting some countries to possibly put something like that in.
Okay, so what have you seen of the airlines themselves putting measures in place whilst you're in flight, for example?
So again, as we sort of mentioned previously, different airlines are putting different policies in place. This is in response to the national authorities' requirements. Some airlines are enforcing a seatbelts at all time policy.
Okay.
So they are not turning the seatbelt off at all. If you do need to use the toilets, it's very much back to school. Put your hand up, call the cabin attendant. Please, miss, I need to go to the toilet. And they're escorting you. Obviously, what they're trying to do is that's predominantly actually to protect their staff. To stop people hanging around in a galley, to stop people wandering around willy-nilly. Some airlines on shorter flights are not carrying out cabin services. Some are restricting to cold drinks and cold snacks only. They're not doing
food preparation
hot beverage services. It's obviously it's very difficult to have those kind of open trade meals, even though everything's nice and sealed in the patch. You still potentially have risks with the trays, whereas a pack of peanuts comes out of a box, it's handed over with gloves on. So there is definitely a change in the current cabin service levels across some airlines. Again, some of those measures are specific to certain airlines because it's in response perhaps to a company policy to protect their staff. IATA have been working very hard with the airlines to try and sort of come up with ideas to reduce risk. And I know one of the things that in particular could be of concern to your customers that's been mooted is the prohibition of hand luggage.
Yes,
it is one of those items that has actually been discussed, but at the moment nothing has been formalised. Obviously, from your customer's perspective, there's a lot of camera equipment there. It's very expensive. It could create a myriad of insurance problems for airlines in terms of high value items going in the hold, the potential for those to become damaged, broken if they're not in a protected bag. So personally, I think it's something that the airlines might actually try and resist. But at the end of the day, they'll have to follow their national authorities and the international authorities.
Yeah, we're certainly not out of it yet. So, and when you then land, let's assume you've battled all through all of those hurdles and you've got there. What have you seen about car hire, for example? I mean, people going on holiday and sharing a small space of a car together. What have you seen about that?
Absolutely. I mean, car hire is a very interesting one. Obviously, from a social distancing perspective in a country, it is good for avoiding mass transit and therefore that infection. That you're keeping a group of people contained in a small environment. And of course, disinfection of a vehicle is pretty straightforward for the car hire companies to carry out. So it doesn't create too much of a additional burden for them. However, you do have to be cautious of a country's regulations. They may restrict people from different households being in one vehicle. So whilst you may have just sat on an aircraft with 320 people from different households for 8 hours, the country that you're traveling to is not going to allow you to sit in a car with 8 people from different households.
And hotels, what have you seen about that?
So hotels, again, the primary issue comes down to the disinfection and protection, obviously, for the staff and the customers. Now, each hotel chain or independent hotels are varying in their approach, but there's a lot of common items that we're seeing, including increased cleaning and hygiene procedures. I know one of the major chains is putting in place a deep clean procedure, so where your room is turned over at the end of the stay and clean. What they're actually doing is they're using more intense antibacterial products, and they're actually then sealing the door on the room.
Wow.
So almost like a crime scene tape, they're putting this tape around it to show this room has been deep cleaned with an antibacterial product. So it's peace of mind for the customer
that's real peace
upon
of mind.
getting into the room. Obviously, social distancing in the check-in areas, in the restaurants. Fitness centres are being moved around for those that are crazy enough to want to run on a treadmill while they're on holiday. Some of the hotels are closing down any buffet options, so breakfast in particular, where it's been a buffet breakfast in historic times, it's potentially moving to that kind of a la carte. It may still be an all-you-can-eat, but you're going to have to order it. So that may delay your breakfast time a little bit. If you're on one of these trips, you might have to just allocate an extra 15, 20 minutes for your breakfast.
Or be out early enough not to need it.
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely.
Good stuff. So how can you see it all shaping up in the long term then?
Obviously, it's a very difficult one to call, Rich. We're seeing that the world is still learning about coronavirus.
Yeah, absolutely.
A vaccine is in development. The world can't, the world's scientists at the moment can't agree on whether having had the virus protects you from it in the future. It's very difficult to try and, have an idea of how that's going to develop, particularly in the short and medium term. Additionally, as each country did at the start of the crisis, there are very different ways of dealing with this scenario. It could be a requirement that you have to have a negative coronavirus test within a set period of time prior to departure. So you must have been tested within 72 hours, and it must come back negative. You may be required to take a test upon arrival into the country, which is something that we're seeing in a couple of European countries. Iceland is one of the good examples for this. They have a multitude of those options available. So you can either present yourself at the border at Reykjavik Airport with a negative coronavirus test, I believe that was done within 72 hours of your departure, or you can actually pay to have a test done at the airport. Now, obviously, Reykjavik and Iceland is a small airport and country, so they have the ability to turn those tests around quite quickly.
Yeah,
I can't imagine the same being in place at Tokyo Narita, for example.
My goodness, no. Sure.
you can go along, you can have your test done. You pay, I think it's an equivalent of about 150 euros at the moment.
Right.
You pay that, you have the test done, and then if your test unfortunately comes back positive, you are mandated to enter a quarantine in Iceland.
Yeah.
Obviously, if it's negative, if it's negative, then you're happy to go on your way. So I suppose it comes down to, would you rather take the risk and spend 150 euros when you get there to potentially have to spend 2 weeks in a nice expensive Icelandic hotel, or do you want to get a free test done here before you go?
But as you say, then if you are then tested positive, then the other 200 odd people or whatever it was on the flight, maybe not that many now, but they've all got to be contacted as well, and they've all got to come back and be tested, haven't they, as well?
Absolutely. I mean, that is obviously, that's going to be a potential issue as well, and equally, as much as the countries are putting in the restrictions, airlines may well turn around and say, well, you can't board our flight unless you can prove that you're negative.
Yeah, absolutely.
So, there could even be testing at departure airports coming into place.
No, I can see that. I mean, that's one of the big things that affects a company like COAP, isn't it? Because if we were out for like a 10-day, 2-week trip, and God forbid one of us came down with symptoms, then we're all going to have to isolate at the moment. And, that's it's just so complicated.
It is, yeah. It is obviously one of the things that COAP, does have to consider with these things. In the same way that a family group going, if one person catches it, then the whole family group is affected. Now, obviously, there are things that you can do, and you can either ask or even mandate your customers to do to help mitigate that risk. Be it you must wear a mask whenever you're on the tour and not in your hotel room, provision of hand sanitizer and use of it on a regular basis, not handing cameras over to sort of, oh, have a look at this.
Yeah,
You
sure.
could even turn around and say, well, we have to use gloves.
Yeah.
That's obviously something that the COAP policy will help guide,
Yes, indeed.
guided by those national policies as well.
Yeah, it's something that we're very closely working on it. And a bit like you said earlier, so much of this is going to be event specific because the risks will be different, and the amount of people will be different, and the type of event that we're doing, and what's actually going to take place on that event, and the length of it will be different each time. So we'll have like a blanket risk assessment and method statement and policies and procedures in place to be COVID secure, as they say. But then they'll be refined for each individual event. And of course, each individual person that's joining that event will have to sign up to it and be part of it. And then we're going to also, on top of that, be joining in with the host as well. So if we're doing a particular event at a particular place, then they'll have their own risk assessments that we also plug into. So there's going to be some roadblocks and some paperwork and everything else. And when the time's right, we're absolutely all over it. I think some of the UK-based events will be a lot easier to execute than traveling overseas at the moment. There's no two ways about it.
Absolutely, and it is definitely something that is going to have to be looked at in great depth. One of the other potential pitfalls that you'll actually have with this is, whilst all this advice that's been pumped out is from the UK government, obviously we have parts of the United Kingdom where there is devolution in place. So, for example, a customer who may wish to join you from Scotland may actually not be able to join you because the Scottish Parliament has put a devolved policy in place, which means that quarantine still exists.
Yeah.
So it's not just, it's not as simple as UK policy, and equally for any UK events that COAP is looking at running, that could still be the case. At the moment, it's my understanding that the Welsh government is still advising against travel to England for the Welsh.
Yeah, no, it's a very complicated situation about it, which is
one
of the great reasons. We work as a team together is to ensure that we look after our customers as much as possible. So, tell the guys a little bit about why that sort of thing's important and why travel counsellors as a part of COAP's travel is so important.
So obviously, as a travel specialist, I have the finger on the pulse, but it's not just myself. We have 1,600 travel counsellors globally who are all looking at their own countries and individual countries. We have a great communication method between all of us. So as well as the information that we're finding out as individuals, we do also have a fantastic team at Travel Counsellors Head Office who are constantly monitoring all the FCO advice changes. We have a fantastic financial protection program in place for a variety of scenarios, which has been in place, for a long time, and COAP customers have benefited from where things have had to change. And actually, there have been changes where your customers haven't even known about it, but it's been a conversation between you because it's circumstances outside of our control. But that's the level of protection. We use the trusted travel motto because we are trusted by our customers. And actually, one of the better things that has come out of the coronavirus is actually we, as travel counsellors, were voted number one for the dealing with refunds and rebookings during the coronavirus pandemic. And that was all voting by our customers. And we were up against, all those independents, all those big tour operators like Chewy, Hayes Travel and everything else. So, we care. And that's our big thing. One of our strap lines is, with us, it's personal. And
that's right.
We treat everything as a personal trip. Yeah,
no, that's really good to hear. And that obviously then combined with COAP's unrivaled service and everything else makes for a great team.
Absolutely.
Good
Absolutely.
No, we're all very much looking forward to the day when this can happen. And but we want to, obviously it's got to happen when it's right. Yeah.
Definitely. There's, as we've said, quite a few times, it's all about risk mitigation. It's all about people being comfortable with traveling.
Yeah.
And obviously it is all about sort of sticking to those national requirements.
Certainly not going to jump the gun, that's for sure.
No, no.
All right. Well, thanks very much indeed for your time, Alec. It's been enlightening to hear exactly what's been going on behind the scenes with the travel industry. And, you know, patience is going to be a virtue in this case, isn't it? We all want to be out there. We all want to get it right, but it's got to be the right time to do it as well. So we'll be looking at the UK scenario. We'll be looking at all the advice and making the decisions based on that alone. So bringing it back onto a more local and specifically aviation enthusiast level. So we're seeing that some air shows are still taking place in Europe and, you know, maybe in the States as well. Obviously, America's slightly different category, as we've said, but let's thinking about some of the European events that may still happen in the future, maybe like September, October time. What's your thoughts on those? I mean, are they going to be just open to residents only? Can we travel over there? What's your thoughts?
It may be that the country where an air show is being held, their borders are completely closed. So yeah, it may only be residents of that country that can travel.
Yeah.
It may be that they have travel corridors in place with a small handful of countries, so residents from 3 or 4 countries can attend. It may be that the borders are completely wide open. One of the big difficulties that we're seeing, and I know that the Germans have had this recently, is this big spike, the so-called second wave.
Right.
Now, you could plan a trip to an air show. It could all be looking lovely and rosy, but then they have that spike in the week leading up to it. And it may be that they either close a region, it may be that they close an entire country down because of that second wave and to try and avoid it. Now, obviously, that trip may have to be cancelled at the last minute.
Or even whilst we're out there.
Or potentially even while you're out there. Now, obviously, while you're out there, it's potentially a bit easier if you're not staying within that region, because you just basically go and find other things that you can do. And you know, that's going to put your planning skills to the test, Rich, because you're going to have to come up with something on the hoof for that one.
I'm all right with that
but,
one.
You know, particularly if something gets cancelled, let's say 2 days prior to your departure. If it's a region closed down or an event cancellation, but the airlines are still flying to the major airport, then that's where the travel insurance comes into play, because that's actually going to be the only way that yourself and your clients are actually going to be able to, you know, essentially recover from that scenario. So, again, you know, as we discussed earlier, the travel insurance industry has had quite a beating with this one, and it's going to be very, very important. I would say certainly until there is a widespread vaccination program in place, that people are making sure that they're reading the fine print on on that insurance, and that it covers all the eventualities. And again, consider going into isolation prior to a trip if you don't want to run the risk that that trip may be cancelled.
Yeah, I see.
Because you come down with it.
So we've obviously seen as well that, I mean, Shuttleworth has opened up for an air show. So there's smaller events, and they've done a really good job of making sure that that event can take place.
For those that don't know, obviously I have been working within the COVID testing and track and trace programs while the travel industry has been going through such a bad time. And this has given me some quite interesting insight to see how the country's response is developing, but also how the restrictions and requirements for events are going to potentially be used in the future. So I think one of the things that we're seeing on the high street that, you know, everybody can equate to has been the opening of pubs over this last weekend. Now, they are taking contact details for people who have been there, so that the track and trace people can be in touch if they need to. I would imagine that's going to be the case at Shuttleworth. Obviously, we're seeing a raft of policies in place there. Such as you having a specific box for your car. You can move around in that box, but you can't go outside of it. Unless you're going to visit a food vendor, I believe, or to use the toilets. No static in place at those air shows. So it's going to be interesting to see how those kind of events do develop in the UK. and whether there are going to be additional policies. I think, sort of the die-hard airshow supporters might look at it and go, well, if there's no static, then why would I want to go? I don't know where my car's going to be parked. I might be right at the back of the field and need a 25,000 mil lens to get a photo of something on the display line. It's going to be interesting to see how that actually works for Shuttleworth. I mean, I wish them all the best.
Absolutely, fair play to them. Yeah.
Absolutely, yeah. Fair play to them for putting it on and for trying to come up with something within the policy. Obviously, some of the night shoots that you've done previously, it'll be interesting to see how you may be able to work on those with the restrictions in place. Is it going to be time slots? Is it going to be numbers limited? These are all things that are going to need to be looked at for the UK events.
That's right. Yeah,
I think one of the potential killers for the non-aviation enthusiasts, perhaps, with shows and the days out for the families and those with the kids, are we going to see the end of interaction with flight crew?
Yeah.
If we do get to the point where a static part comes back, are the crew going to be mandated to just leave the aircraft and go? They're not going to be selling merchandise. They're not going to be signing Little Johnny's thing. They're not going to let Little Johnny go and sit up in the cockpit of the Strike Eagle. The Reds, obviously they're such great ambassadors for the UK and the RAF. And a lot of that comes down to their interaction with the general public,
very much so,
particularly children. So
yeah, that's a great point. Yeah,
it'll be very interesting. Not just for whatever events may happen this year, but into 2021. Could this change the landscape for UK air shows in the way that other major events such as Shoreham did from a flying perspective?
Indeed. Yeah, no, it's definitely yet another one to watch, that's for sure.
It certainly is.
So thanks for your work in the background for us, Alec, and look forward to signing on the dotted line for the next trip. Can't wait.
No problems, Rich. Thanks very much for taking the time and for having me on. Obviously, I look forward to supporting COAP and COAP customers on future travel.
Great stuff. Cheers for now.
Thanks.
Oh, well, I can't say I didn't warn you. Goodness me. It's so complicated, isn't it? There is some really good news out there. Things are opening up. We can start traveling again. But goodness me, there is so much to think about. Every step, everything from the airport, the airline, to when you arrive, what happens when you're out there is all still got to be worked out. There's a long way to go. Fortunately, we've had a great chat there from Alec. You've got me, you've got Alec, but making this happen for you. We will be there when the time's right. Take care.